Welcome back to Troubled, a podcast by survivors of institutional child abuse, for survivors and the general public. As always, our mission is to expose the U.S.'s predatory prevalence for mass, legal, for-profit to the tune of billions and billions of dollars per year, child abduction, detainment, trafficking, and torture model. This has been who America is since the very beginning. Reminder that residential, institutionalized, behavior modification-based youth abuse is a colonizer construct. So it's everywhere in the world. In the U.S., obviously, it started with the residential schools for the indigenous children. By the early 1920s, a majority, like we're talking 83% of all indigenous children were in residential schools. We know a lot more about the reality in Canada as their Truth and Reconciliation Commission has already begun the process of exhuming the murdered, missing, and Indigenous children. And they're up past 10,000 children found. We're beyond 10,000. And so if you're interested in that, if you're just like interested in this jazz as a whole and the Canadian situation, I could not recommend this nonprofit more. They're called Children's First Society. I'll link them in the show notes. We follow them and share their content on all social media platforms. I'm pretty sure they're Children's First Society everywhere. Again, I'll link it. Check it out. They're a nonprofit in Canada run by a second generation survivor. So their parents were residential school survivors. And one of their founders is an MMIW survivor. So as of yesterday, if you're listening to this in real time, this is the week of my birthday, April 29th, through the beginning of May. And so April 29th to May 5th is the week of awareness for missing and murdered Indigenous women. So you can share real women in your communities that have been abducted with the hashtags No More Stolen Sisters, hashtag MMIW, hashtag MMIW2GS. I mean, the list goes on. Please connect with these nonprofits. So Canada Children's First Society is absolutely excellent. She escaped her abuser. She shared her story on social media. So just go check it out from them. It's just, you can't make this jazz up. So we've been using them as a resource when we've been keeping track of this count. So over 10,000 children have been found in mass unmarked graves. These aren't burials. They weren't buried. And reminder that residential schools, this colonizer construct of coercive assimilation, is or was historically run very much in a partnership between the colonizer arm of religion. So the Roman Catholic Church, as their canon was designed by Constantine, who wasn't a Christian at all, and a complete psychopath, right? At this point, around this time in history and before and after, you have colonization or imperialism, as we're going to probably call it, before colonies exist, utilizing these emperor popes and all this jazz to forcibly convert everywhere they go in and take over, right? And so you do have that continued into the 1800s, where you have these churches, these pope kings, pope emperors. The churches are running society. The conversion into the religion in order to make this a colonizer situation, as opposed to like you choosing to convert to a new religion, is that you didn't have a choice, right? It was either you adopt to and assimilate to our religious preference, or we murder you, we murder your family, we take everything you have, rape and murder your daughters in front of you. Oh my gosh, if you guys didn't know, trigger warning on everything we do or say, especially for me. This is Miranda, by the way. Like, everything I say or do is a trigger warning, so reminder. But, so you have this forcible conversion. And so through these, and as these governments come into play, by the way, in the early 1900s, late 1800s, they create this relationship with these church institutions. So by the end of the 1800s, early 1900s, in Ireland, Canada, the US, you've got these governments in this really sick relationship with the church, funding and mandating certain funnels into these institutions, either for children or for unwed mothers, fallen women, or, you know, maybe you committed some sort of a crime. It's, you know, we criminalize poverty. And then if you steal bread, now you have to work in a laundry or work in this field or work in this like work labor camp for 20 years or for the rest of your life. In Ireland, the Magdalene laundries is a really excellent example, and definitely check the show notes. I will tag a few specifically traveler activists. So Laura Angela Collins is the author of The Tinker Menace. She is an Irish traveler, and her mother was in the mother and baby homes, and her grandmother was sent to the Magdalene laundries, where the church, the Catholic Church, didn't treat her cancer, and, kept her for free work labor her entire life because she became pregnant out of wedlock. So they medically neglected her into the grave, a mass grave, by the way, even after a decade or so of advocacy from that family specifically to get access to their nan, have her pulled out of a mass unmarked grave so that she can be buried and honored by her family like a person. They're actually trying to construct, I don't know what it's going to be, if it's going to be like, I think it's a condo complex over the Magdalene laundries. This is a crime scene. We know it's a crime scene. The Ryan reports in other countries, the U.S. is really not into acknowledging its past. I mean, we have the UN, which for the record is situated in New York, saying that the United States has committed human rights violations against Black and Indigenous peoples. But obviously, will there be any reconciliation? Will they look at that? Ah, the magic of technology. No time has passed for you, yet 30 minutes and an entire blunt has passed for me, because I could not fathom my own rhetorical question. No, the United States is not going to hold themselves accountable. This is why we are having public debates over whether CRT should be taught in schools. This is how you have people like me who grew up both in parochial and like blue ribbon public education in the 90s and early 2000s in Connecticut, where I was taught as a white woman to be colorblind, that civil rights, it all ended back in the black and white picture era. And if you don't know, you should all know that all of those pictures from Selma and everything around that time, those were color photography. Color photography was totally a thing at that time. The U.S. deliberately black and whited those photographs to propagandize this perception that this had all happened in the past, and we were so beyond and over it. I remember being a little kid in Catholic school, reading about these heroes, these civil rights leaders, and wishing I'd been born in an era in which I could rise to the opportunity of being an ally, being someone who was willing to put it all on the line to deconstruct and dismantle systems of oppression, especially as someone born into white privilege and white supremacy. It's totally okay if you have to stop listening to this podcast for a minute, or in general. Had a lot of conversations with some people who feel that some of our perspectives, let's just call it my perspectives, are very radical, and they are, and thank you. I find that to be a compliment. I obviously get personally triggered when I see social media posts or podcasts talking about reforming behavior modification, reforming the troubled teen industry. These are industries that are based on systemic child abuse. They are racially targeted. They are targeted towards the neurodiverse communities of which I'm a part. They're targeted towards the queer communities of which I'm a part. The TTI is not therapeutic. I do want to finish the conversation systemically to give the roots of residential youth abuse. And for people who are like, why do you care so much about that? You're not Canadian. You're not Irish. You're not Indigenous. I really feel like there's a lot missing from us as advocates within an institutional child abuse space, especially for those of us like myself who are speaking in public forums and to the public, that we recognize the roots of institutional child abuse, and then also specifically of coercive assimilation, of behavior modification. And I don't think we do anyone a service if we just cut a slice of the cake, focus on representing and quote unquote reforming, or as we should be, abolishing that, because the rest of the cake still exists. We can't continue to flail around punching at these boss fights in the dark when really they're just symptoms of causation. I really hope that as we expand this community, that a lot of you guys will start to look at these historical and global issues in the broader picture, recognize the foster care element, right? Recognize how conversion therapy is obviously a part of this. The guy who designed the ABA that tortures neurodiverse kids like me, starting when we were in Montessori preschool and all that jazz, is the same guy who designed conversion therapy to target and torture the queer community. These things are like specifically connected in these ways, but foundationally, they all root from the same root. And that recognition is required in order for us to be capable to zoom out and perceive the macro of the situation that we're dealing with. While there are so many elements, funnels, and also flavors of institutional child abuse, behavior modification, assimilation all falls within a larger and broader power imbalance. And in order for us to be able to completely eliminate and eradicate this danger in our society, we're really going to need to get to the root here. And in order to do that, we're going to need to be capable of working together, not just as individual slices of the cake. So yes, we obviously need coordinated, collected, and, well-communicated, respectable roundtable conversations within conversion therapy advocacy, right? Within foster care advocacy. And we see that. There are hashtags on social media that you can drop into as, a fly on the wall and see what's going on adoptee TikTok, what's going on adoptee Twitter. These people have their own lived experience perspective on what they went through, their specific traumas, and the specific aspects of systemic oppression and abuse in our society that targeted, most likely, in our world, trafficked them and then tortured them. And we believe in a nothing about us without us perspective. I think that even when you're looking at state coalitions, legislative boards, and all of these things, there needs to be a certain percentage of people with lived experience. Think about it. You can't have some sort of substance abuse coalition or substance abuse nonprofit or substance abuse legislation without individuals involved in that who lived through recovery, and also those who work in that field. And so they understand the dynamics internally, of working within the belly of the beast, right? But yet, that is what we see often. We see advocates calling on the public to assist them and getting a seat at a table that they built and that was built for them, but somehow they're being blocked from. And so as historically marginalized, invalidated, silenced, and excluded communities, it's really important to recognize that all of us deal with that. So we want to make sure that we're all very inclusive, and there's a lot of intersectional activism going on. And so as it relates to the Indigenous issues with these original residential schools being targeted at culturally assimilating the original peoples of those lands in all three countries that I mentioned, by the way, because we'll get to it, but the Irish are an excellent example for a lot of people that are going to listen to this podcast or that you're going to personally talk with at Thanksgiving Day tables. The punny digs! These people who identify themselves as unmelanated, I think they're calling themselves hueless on TikTok right now. These conversations with these peoples about decolonization, land back, appropriation, and all of these things are really easily looked at through the lens of what happened in Ireland, because these people look like them. A lot of these people say, hey, I'm Irish, kiss me, I'm Irish. They wear shamrock shirts and poison rivers to make them green once a year. By the way, the Irish have officially asked Americans to please stop doing that to our rivers. So please and thank you. But it's a very good example because they were colonized by people who looked like them, but culturally were not them for 800 years. They were forced to speak another language, practice another religion. They were kicked off of their ancestral lands and put in this really horrible situation where up until the early 1900s, the actual Irish, they couldn't go to secondary school. They couldn't have real jobs. And they were obviously also being trafficked into these work labor programs and having their children taken away and sold to Americans through the Catholic Church and all of these things. And that was English colonialism. The Irish are the indigenous peoples of that land. And so as those of us, especially for myself, as people who want to honor our Irish ancestry and heritage and walk with our ancestors and really do the work that they set out to do there, then, and now, and here where we've been seated. And reminder, if you're Irish and you're like, Indigenous issues in the US don't matter to me. The only reason you exist, the only reason that you are sitting here for some reason listening to my dumb ass is because Choctaw Nation, after being brutally genocided through the Trail of Tears, sent an incredibly significant portion of the funds that they had to the Irish, who were suffering through what the propaganda likes to call the quote-unquote potato famine, not a famine at all, a direct colonial genocide, which Choctaw Nation knew. They were hearing about this through both the Irish soldiers that were helping walk them to their deaths, as well as the British ones joking about killing all the Micks and Paddies, right? And so they felt a kinship. That kinship is still active in both of these communities today. You can see it when the global community tries to bar Indigenous communities from sports they quite literally created. The Indigenous of America created lacrosse. And then on a global scale, you had them being kicked out of, they couldn't play. And so Team Ireland gave up their slot, and the jerseys for these teams have a hybrid of Irish and Indigenous colors, and they used Irish in their Gaeilge on their jerseys. It's excellent. You can see that relationship. And so if you are an Irish American, you have Irish heritage, obviously not claiming any nationality, then you really need to honor that. The only reason that you exist is because Choctaw Nation saved you. The actual Irish understand, recognize, and respect that. And those of us who've been seated on the lands of those who saved us, we need to honor that blood oath. And if we choose to be advocates and activists against institutionalized child abuse on Turtle Island, on the land that belongs to these Indigenous peoples that not only, saved us if we're Irish, but went first in these forcible mass residential youth homes. Remember, if you tried to save your kid, if the American government came to take your Indigenous child and brutally torture them in a residential program, and you were like, hell no, you're not taking my kid, they beat, killed you, or they put you in Alcatraz. Google it, right? I mean, this information is now free. In recognizing that these torture tactics that were used on you when you were institutionally abused in a residential youth program were originally intended for, utilized on, and perfected in the deplorable assimilation of Indigenous youth, then shouldn't you have a respect level to not only include them in these conversations in the states where you stand? If you're looking at state legislature or reform, you should also be looking at reviewing, exhuming, and reconciliation for the tribes that were brutalized in your area. That should be part of that. It shouldn't just be looking at the troubled teen industry. It shouldn't just be looking at tough love programs or religious specifically programs. It should be a broader picture. And when we're on a national level, if we're going to be introducing any sort of institutional child abuse legislation, reform, or again, a look back to see if reconciliation is necessary, which we shouldn't have to ask that question, but rather, how can we do that? And for the record, Deb Haaland is reviewing that. I think it's July when the United States should finally have their recommendations for what we're going to be doing moving forward. But again, if you're part of that, because a lot of us are, we need to make sure that not only are Indigenous voices, advocates, and survivors included, but that they are centered. Their voices are centered, elevated, and amplified. This is an imperative part of advocacy. And so I really hope that if you're still listening, and hopefully if you look into these issues, the hashtag, for the record, everychildmatters, is focused on residential schools for the Indigenous. There's a lot of excellent information out there, but I hope that that will really inspire you to really be a good advocate and to make sure that you are intersectional and inclusive in all of your work. Because not only did the abuse target these communities before us, but these communities are also who's come before us in advocacy. And there's a lot that we can learn from them. But we definitely don't want to be utilizing all of these lawsuits, court cases, and data globally to then imitate their success rather than also include them in furthering that advocacy. So back to my original rhetorical question, which got me on the ADHD, super high on cannabis, blunt rant. So if the US isn't going to take accountability, then how did the others do it and how do we get there? Well, number one, others didn't volunteer to do it either. This has always been survivor-led. And let's just even speak specifically about residential programs for children, right? Survivors of institutional child abuse. In Ireland, the way that it moved forward was a specific advocate who felt personally connected to the issue. Her name is Katherine Corliss. She's my personal hero. She's why we're doing the podcast, because that's what she did. That's how she used it to get broad. But so Katherine Corliss grew up next to Tuam. Currently, we know that there are at least 900 children whose bodies are in the sewers or on the grounds of the Tuam mother and baby homes, right? She grew up next to it and went to school with some of the kids from the program. She talks about it best. Please listen to the many, many, many podcasts with Katherine Corliss. But one day, through awful children or horrible peer pressure, she decided, wouldn't it be funny to offer a candy to one of these children in the home that's never had candy before, but instead it's a rock in a candy wrapper, right? It was a traumatizing situation, and she never forgot the trauma she caused to that child. And so I think she was in her 40s when she decided to do this. She had really tried to find out like what happened to the kids and really what was going on. And there had been rumors that there were children buried on the grounds. So she took like a local course, and you can literally copy Katherine Corliss. She took a local course on how to match records and how to do all this jazz. And so she requested both the birth and death records of all the children at Tuam. And she went through all of them manually on her kitchen table, and she found 900 missing names. So these are birth certificates that did not have a matching death certificate and were never transferred out of the home. And so one could assume they died there, but for some reason they didn't want to issue them a death certificate. Katherine had lived in the same town her whole life. And so she knew of a ton of rumors and stories over the years of children falling into the sewers and coming up with baby skulls or things of that nature. Obviously, the Irish government had absolutely zero interest in excavation or investigation of Tuam or the Magdalen laundries or any of these other things. So Katherine had to go to the media. She did tons of podcast interviews and eventually got to the UN. And it was through that public global pressure on the Irish government that they opened up the Ryan reports and they did the Mother and Baby Home Commission. And obviously there's so much more to this story. And I would love, obviously, again, to interview Katherine Corliss because she's my hero, but I haven't. So just go check out the many, many, many podcasts with Katherine. There's even some second gen survivor doc programs that are available if you have a VPN. I will say, which is very interesting to me, is that per America, not Ireland, there is a huge block on a lot of content on RTE Player or YouTube. If you're not familiar, the Republic of Air and Television, RTE, you can check out their RTE Player as an app or on their website and like watch a broad variety of shows. I use it as I'm trying to learn Irish to watch shows that are in the Irish language so that I get used to hearing the different dialects and the conversational, subtleties that I'm not going to get from the courses I'm taking. I've noticed that even there was a documentary about the Burren. My family's from the Burren. I visited the Burren over my 33rd birthday, with the intention fully of walking off a cliff in Ireland. But I didn't do it. But I found my cliff. Another story for another day. Anyways, there is like a big censorship level when it comes to any documentary programs that are either about colonization or institutional abuse. And so the most recent
I believe it's a docu-series on the mother and baby homes. I can't see it. I don't have a VPN. Somebody wants to send me their VPN login. My email's in the show notes. Sorry, guys. Like, it's my birthday weekend. So there will be lots of Miranda's ADHD coming out with singing things horribly that don't need to be done. And I'm not sorry. But bringing it back to the Irish investigations and reform, there is a ton of criticism from survivors and their families about how everything has been handled. And this is actually something, if you're interested in this, please hop on Twitter, especially because I personally find that most of the survivors and advocates that are on the ground on these situations are active on Twitter. Oh, yeah, Elon Musk. If you're listening to this in real time, Twitter is about to be changing, or at least Twitter thinks. I guess we'll see. But Twitter is honestly my favorite social media app. I kind of use it as like a news aggregator. It's my favorite place to meet new advocates. The advocates that are active on Twitter are more proactive. There's a lot of people that I've met on that app that have then translated into real life advocacy. They're parts of teams and projects and campaigns and legislature that we've been working on. And so I would say if you're looking to expand your parasocial relationships, something that you can learn a lot about by clergy Reverend Chris Wilson on TikTok and Instagram, by the way, because parasocial relationships are this huge thing we need to start looking at as social media becomes a very normal part of a lot of people's lives, especially with isolation. Hop on Twitter to hear from these peoples. But there's a few things that I, as a non-professional, nobody asked for my opinion, will just bring up. And these are things, this is the reason I want you guys to look at this is because this is the historical record of how these investigations, reforms, and reconciliations go. And so we really want to use the good parts as a blueprint, right, for survivor advocacy, but also we want to look at the obstacles and the corruption and these elements that come into place so that we can proactively prevent them in our own advocacy. And that's a big main purpose of why I want to break this down. And I don't want to spend 30 minutes on the Mother and Baby Home Commission or the Ryan reports. So what I will say is there's been a lack of communication and inclusion with survivors, both from the mother and baby homes, but also specifically a subsect of adoptees. These children that were trafficked through these homes, their documents were not where they weren't real. So you have a good portion of them, by the way, went to Australia, Europe, and the US. And so you've got like these pockets specifically, because again, these were trafficked through specific Catholic dioceses. So in Boston and Philadelphia, I've noticed that there's a big grouping of these survivors who were adults by the time they realized that their documents were falsified. They couldn't get passports. They couldn't work because they couldn't fill out I-9s. Fun fact, insertion racist element of this, there's a survivor from the Family Foundation School, which is my program. Obviously, if you guys have ever listened to us or if you're a survivor yourself, you know that adoptees make up a majority of institutionalized children in the United States. And that obviously is going to include the troubled teen industry or behavior modification or RTCs, right? And so the adoptee element is something that we definitely need to be huge on. So this survivor from the family school is also a survivor from Freedom Village in New York. Both programs were in the same area. They transferred kids among them. He wound up in the prison system later in life. And once he'd served his time, right, done everything he was supposed to do, he thinks he's going to get out and get to spend time with his kids and his family. No. This motherfucker sent on a plane deported to a country he's never been to that speaks a language he doesn't speak. He's tatted up because he's been living in New York, right? And tats in this country are a sign that you are a dangerous gang member. So he's getting jumped all over the place. This shit is insane. And this is not rare. But this is the racial element, because how many of these white Christian adoptees that were sold through the Catholic Church, specifically from Ireland to the US, were deported back to Ireland? Not a trick question. If you know of one, please link us to that. But anyways, these people want the ability to access their medical records. Side note, just like in the United States residential school system and in Canada, these same companies that were testing vaccines and other medical treatments
on these children without consent or permission were doing that to the children in Ireland. So like, I just want to be incredibly clear. These global pharmaceutical and medical companies were testing all of these things on these children in these residential programs in Ireland, Canada, and the United States. And we found out about the Irish Jazz because some of these adoptees, these vaccines were included in their records. It's widely known that the polio vaccine came through this way, you guys. And in case you're like, well, those things saved a lot of people. Cool. You know how many fucking kids it killed while they were testing? This jazz isn't remotely fucking ethical. But the testimonies from the survivors that were requested during this commission, initially they tried to seal all of this for 30 years and to not review it further. And the reason, you guys, corruption element, and we're going to get that in the US too, is that some of the TDs currently in Ireland, their family members and people that they're directly and personally connected to were the TDs and were the people involved in this human trafficking schema in the first place. So comparison and contrast for all of us who are survivors from programs in the United States or we're in the United States, most of us should be aware at this point that Mitt Romney and Bain, this is like this boss battle, big element of the TTI, right? Obviously, Mitt Romney has absolutely no intention of holding people who abuse children in residential treatment accountable, because that would require him holding himself accountable, which, again, with the rhetoricals, is that really gonna happen? Which, if you saw survivors being personally triggered by Paris Hilton having promos with Mitt Romney about how he's so thrilled to support the ACCA or any preventions of institutionally abusing children, like, obviously, we know that's absolute bullshit. And so we're like, what the fuck is going on here? And back to what the fuck is going on in Ireland, they used this opportunity to get hundreds of survivors to submit and submit themselves to re-traumatization in order to submit verbal testimony. These testimonies were locked, not only from the public, but from the survivors themselves. And still currently, all of these records, as far as like who people really are, who their mothers, their brothers, their sisters, what medical was done to them in these programs, it's all locked from them. And if any of their family, mother, grandmother, auntie, brother, child, was killed in these complexes and thrown in the ground, they have zero access or accountability. And in the case of the infamous Bessborough Magdalen laundries, what we see now is them fast tracking massive development on top of this mass grave in an effort to seal all of this evidence in time. And it's not just evidence. These are people that real, living, breathing people right now have been desperately begging to have returned to them so that they can bury them and mourn them and have them. And they certainly don't want them tossing a parking lot or a condo on top. And so if you're still listening, if this is of interest to you, again, hop over on Twitter, support the survivor advocates just like us who are desperately pleading for international support to pressure their government to hold all of the nuns, priests, politicians, the people who ran these facilities, who profited from these facilities, who trafficked, tortured, raped, and murdered these children accountable, because they're still alive. And I get that there's some weird perception that we don't hold old people accountable for what they did. But the woman who had Emmett Till murdered admitted that she made it up. And I still want to watch that trial. And again, this is a global issue. So let's shift over to our continent. And Canada, again, they have their Truth and Reconciliation Commission. And this, again, was instigated and led by survivor coalitions and survivor advocacy. There were multiple class action lawsuits, and I would like to specifically point out, respect the survivors of St. Anne's School who spent years in court with the Canadian government, spent millions of dollars trying to deflect responsibility and reconciliation with St. Anne's survivors. In the last year or so, Canada has started, like we'd mentioned, to review, exhume, and return the missing and murdered Indigenous children. Canada's count again being beyond 10,000, and again followed Children's First Society to keep up with it. And while Ireland hasn't really done anywhere near that level, because remember, they haven't even dealt with the 900 children minimum at Tuam alone. Currently, the Irish count for children who were murdered in these institutions and buried in mass graves on the grounds is over 9,000. And I just want to remind people for perspective. And again, the reason I want to bring this to the global perspective is like at the end of these residential programs, we're going to call it the end. We all know it's not the end because we're all living in it. It exists in all these countries still. It's just not the same. But at the time that this mandatory abduction, detention, and trafficking through a direct funded and forced relationship between the state and the church, by the time this stopped being the everyday norm and became more of what we would hope would be an exception, although are we really the exception? It was fucking 1996, y'all. 1996. And I just want to remind everybody that the US, while, you know, we're the same, it's the late 90s, right? The federal government still sends and pays for Indigenous children to go to boarding schools. And nowadays they try to present it like some excellent opportunity for some grade A education and cultural immersion or what, I don't know what you want to call it, but I doubt it. I don't think any of these governments should be funding or in any way involved in sending Indigenous children to boarding schools, not after what they've done and what they've yet to answer for. And as I previously mentioned, the United States Department of Interior, led by the first Indigenous woman to be in this position, Deb Harlan, which finger snaps for days, that is fantastic. She's going to announce this summer how we will begin reviewing, investigating, exhuming, and dealing with reconciliation with the United States residential school system. But for the record, we have returned a few kids. And many of you may have seen this because the Rosebud Sioux Nation live feeded this experience. They sent escorts from their tribal communities to personally escort these children home. And if you think it's anywhere near the 9 or 10,000 that Ireland and Canada amassed, you're just going to be so fucking disappointed. It's literally 9. The United States has found and returned 9 children. These children were mostly the children of the chiefs, and they were brutally tortured and murdered at the Carlisle School. The Carlisle School for the U.S. is probably the most infamous because it was one of the biggest, and a majority of the children that were tortured in the U.S. system went through Carlisle. Obviously, there are more than 9 children at the Carlisle School alone. And as far as that goes, we all know that Dozier School for Boys in Florida that was not targeted at Indigenous children. This was targeted at just straight old American orphans or, you know, troubled boys. It was a boy program in Florida. Dozier has over 100 kids buried in the ground that they killed. Maybe you are like me and you will hyperfixate on focusing on a specific narrative, either looking at the St. Anne's situation, looking at the Tuam situation, specifically looking at Carlisle, looking at Dozier, because there's been advocacy groups from those specific programs that have gotten us to where we are today.
And I mean, this is our 3rd season. So if you've been listening to us for a while or you follow us on social media, I hope by now you realize how important it really is for us to make sure that we carry the advocates from the past whose shoulders we stand on top of, who've paved the way for us, with us now, whether they're still with us now or whether this whole thing, this mission that we're on cost their lives. You've probably heard Liz on here a lot, Liz Ionelli from the family school, one of my personal mentors who helped keep me alive and really, I guess we're going to say, recruited me into activism. The only reason she's involved is because her best friend from the program and after, John Martin Crawford, he's the one who got our program closed. He got to Congress and helped to create the first legislation nationally that just kept getting pushed from George Miller to Adam Schiff, and Adam Schiff has never moved forward on it. And after he accomplished all of that, and I'll link his testimony in case magically you haven't heard it yet, or will I end this episode with it? Whatever, it doesn't matter. This guy gave his life, because at the end of the day, closing the program and creating national federal legislation that was never going to go anywhere broke his fucking heart. over the last few years of me being involved outside of my own community of survivors, and I think that maybe it's different now, but in the past, I think a lot of us got active with survivors from our own program pretty exclusively, and then maybe some of us trickled up into the more collective advocacy realm. And in the last few years, for me personally, of joining the broader collective survivor community, a lot has gone down. And I've known far too many people personally. I've worked with them personally on projects. They were involved with us on certain legislation. They were involved with us on specific action items, lawsuits, the podcast. Too many of those people are not with us today. I've said it before that I feel like being proactively involved in the solution, aka this podcast, also creating our nonprofit, working on the legislations, both in Missouri and New York, and exposing our programs in those areas, and supporting survivors and getting their stories out there and getting lawsuits open and all this jazz has been my saving grace. Like this relationship with Troubled, this ownership of that label and a reshifting of that, a reclaim, has been the most empowering experience of my life. But it has simultaneously been the most fucking dangerous experience of my life. I'm personally incredibly confident that there are other dimensions, that there are other timelines where this is exactly what took me out. And I'm still pretty confident that that's what's going to happen in this timeline too. The title of the New York Times cover article that really came out with the Family Foundation School in 2018 was, "It's like who's next? An alarming suicide rate at a boarding school in New York," right? But we've talked about this in a lot of past episodes, especially in the first season where it's a lot of FFS kids talking about that article. It's not like we're wondering who's next. We're wondering when it's our turn, when it's this person that I personally know and it's my friend. That's what it is. I've been personally open, so has Amanda, so have a lot of people involved in our nonprofit and our podcast, that we live with suicidality, that we have serious mental health trauma from what we experienced. We're also all neurodivergent, right? And as someone with ADHD, a main symptom of that neurodivergence is RSD. This rejection sensitivity dysphoria, for those of you who don't know. That doesn't mean I'm paranoid and I think everybody hates me, but let's just be incredibly clear. Based on my lived personal experience, that's fucking true. Whether or not I was the scapegoat or the black sheep in my family, whether or not in my parochial school education with all the nuns who wanted me to sit down, stay still, and stay quiet, and thus put me through applied behavior analytics therapy, ABA, which is torture, and drugged me without my consent, whether or not that didn't happen, I went into the troubled teen industry. And whether or not I wanted to believe that the troubled teen industry didn't break me or didn't change me or personally affect the trajectory of my entire life, I mean, it's been 18 years this weekend from the day I turned 18 and I walked away, and I haven't gotten any further. I know I'm a good person. I know what I've done, but a lot of what I do every day of my life, you know, whether it was 7 years of fucking animal rescue, which the trauma of that is, I'm going to work the rest of my life to get over that, right? Or whether it's been committed to this, you know, we have the podcast, the nonprofit, my day job is in child abuse prevention and intervention. But it doesn't matter how many animals I save or kids whose parents I convinced not to send them into programs or laws we change or my friends that we handled and walked through getting access to real justice for what happened to them. I am still standing at that table. They are still telling me that I am a worthless human being, that no one has ever loved me and no one could ever love me like I am. And unless I fundamentally change things about who I am as a person, no one will ever love me. And again, trigger warning, duh. But like for those of us who went through the tough love flavor, that the closest thing we'll ever get to being loved is to be gang raped on the street and murdered like we deserve. That's what I was told as a child at the family foundation school by people that I later realized were fucking pedophiles. And I put it out of my mind for years. But the reality is that those words have become internalized. And the critic in my head is that voice. And to tie it in, I guess something I've really learned from being a fly on the wall in other advocacy-based communities with survivors of a trauma where what they have in common, not only in their mission, but in their experience, is a shared trauma, is that these collective spaces are not safe, especially if that shared trauma is some sort of narcissistic abuse, or in our case, a peer-on-peer attack therapy model. I really can't tell you how many times I've tried to post about Irish traveler activism, or post about the mother and baby homes, or post about conversion therapy, and I tag a bunch of accounts and I'm like, everybody go follow them, they're advocates in this space. And how many times, not only do they publicly or privately hit me up and ask them to never tag them in a post like that again because they're abusers I also tagged, or they just straight up block me. And I didn't mean harm, right? But that ignorance doesn't change the fact that I caused harm in that situation. And this happens in our space too. I mean, it happens to me. I can't tell you how many times I want to just like comment or reach out to somebody who I consider an ally of the community who has reposted something that we've created, like a clip from the podcast or something that we're doing. And then in their caption is like, yeah, this is great. Make sure to go follow and support so-and-so. And that so-and-so is someone who directly and personally has harassed and attacked myself or my friends. And we have to be trauma informed about all of this. I'm not personally in many of the collective Facebook groups anymore. I think I'm mostly in FFS and COH ones because those are the programs that our nonprofit founders are from. And that's what we're personally and proactively working on. But 2 years ago, I was in all the groups and I had like the Facebook profile banner that either said ICU Survivor or TTI Survivor or Breaking Code Silence. And I accepted all these stranger danger friend requests on the internet. You guys remember that time, right? Like if they had a hashtag Breaking Code Silence banner and I do too, then we should be friends. Except you guys, parasocial relationships are not friends. And if the only thing you have in common with someone is shared trauma, then that's the only thing you have in common. And I'm not going to get into it here because number one, we've actually been recording and working on some coverage on this for over a year with the survivors who were directly involved and social workers, so that instead of it being some drama bullshit, it would actually be something that we can learn from in the way that we communicate with and project our own shit on each other. But I think I've said it before, so I'll say it again. I am so sorry for recommending that everybody get involved with Breaking Code Silence. Back when I was doing that in the first season, Breaking Code Silence was a community hashtag campaign, not unlike ICU Survivor. The differences between them being ICU Survivor is geared from either survivor to survivor or the community acknowledging the survivor's experience, whereas Breaking Code Silence was from survivor to the public being like, hey, this is what really happened. And back then in 2019, 2020, when we were all making those videos, both for hashtag Breaking Code Silence and hashtag ICU Survivor, it was a relaunch. So like Sia, Survivors of Institutional Abuse, we've interviewed Jody. She's great. Sia had launched both of those campaigns for survivors on YouTube years ago. I think it was like 2014, 2016, the first time that we all saw those. And so again, 2018, 2019, and into 2020, when we have these coalitions, and again, like kind of a relaunch of SIA as the coalition I was personally involved in, it made a lot of sense for us all to mutually support each other on relaunching these public advocacy campaigns. And those are still great resources. I hope they always are. Please, if you haven't binged them all, I would definitely check out YouTube first because all the long forms are there. And then most people who also shared it on social would like break them up because again, this is like, I think the last videos were 2020, 2021. So it was like 1 minute max on socials at that time. But also, as many of you know, BCS turned into something completely different. And while Breaking Code Silence, especially once it was amplified by a celebrity, reached so many people who otherwise probably would have spent as long as we had not knowing there was a broader community, or really reframing our perspective of our experience from, you know, some sort of thing that happened because I like fucked up as a kid to like a behavior modification torture schema. But after 2 rounds of lawsuits and like 3 iterations of this grouping where you've got survivors going after survivors and trying to gather as much support as possible. So like, AKA, let's bring it back to program, because this is what I think is going on. This isn't just with the BCS jazz. This is with our community as a whole. Our trauma is peer-on-peer attack therapy. Yeah, there's totally the element that the adults are using encounter groups and tough love and stuff on the kids. But the way that they held this culture together was to get the kids to enforce it on other kids. And so if we're interacting with people who also have this shared trauma, this shared experience, this shared programming, but either we or the other person hasn't healed to a certain extent, it totally makes sense that to the extent that we are deflecting or denying our behavior, our trauma, that we are going to deflect and project that on others. It's called DARVO. If you haven't heard about DARVO, like definitely check it out. I think it's a deflect, attack, reverse, victim, offender role. It's a relatively new acronym, but it makes what we're dealing with a lot of sense. And that's what you see on Facebook, on social media, in these groups where somebody asks a question. And since the anti-cult movement has kind of become a cult, you can't ask questions. If you ask questions, what happens, kids? And we're a couple years into having so much public visibility that our community of advocates has grown exponentially since the old SIA days, since the old CAFD days in 2007, 2008. It's a whole new deal now. But somehow, instead of it becoming more inclusive and more diverse and there being more representation, I feel like it's become less. When I look at the public advocates in our community, in our space, I feel like I'm looking in a fucking mirror, y'all. I don't think it's disputable that it's a majority of public advocates against the troubled teen industry are white women who were sent into the TTI through the private funnel. Their parents sent them. Their parents paid. And obviously I can relate to that, and there's a lot of relatability to that. And then the private pay funnel is a huge portion of the funnel, especially in the private tough love based troubled teen industry, but it is not indicative percentage wise of the whole at all. Like, it's just not the majority, but it is being represented as such. And so, yeah, there's a lack of visibility, there's a lack of representation, but it's not just that. It also means that our public advocacy, when we're working collectively, is lacking experience from lived experts within that realm. Example, there is no foster care survivor on our nonprofit's board. So as a nonprofit, if we're going to be getting involved with and supporting legislation that affects foster care, we're not going to lead that legislation. We're going to support that legislation because I don't have the expertise. And to expand that, there is no person of color currently on our nonprofit's board. It's one of the reasons we don't put our faces all out there, because there is something incredibly cringe about a Zoom or a whatever where they're like, hey, meet our like founders, meet our leaders, and it looks like a Stepford Wives Club. Which, to be fair, if we actually did that, I'm not sure we'd look like Stepford Wives, right? We'd just, I don't know, like a cooler version of the Heathers, I guess, because we're tatted up with piercings and shit. But I am certainly in no position to be speaking on or creating legislation on or action items on Black and or Indigenous issues or foster care issues. The extent of that is like, in this podcast, this is a platform that I created. And so it's imperative for me to make sure, like the last 40 minutes of laying framework, groundwork, a foundation of understanding how we fall into this broader situation and making sure that I include these issues. And hopefully our audience is proactive. So I hope that you will follow those hashtags, that you will support those nonprofits and those survivors that are working in their own areas and on their own missions.
But like as a completely outside of institutional child abuse example, when I was living in Texas in a predominantly Black rural community, a community that, let me be very clear, should be, if they could get a good lawyer, protected under heritage laws. It's a community that was originally owned and intended to be owned by a specific family, the Johnson family, when they were freed from slavery in the United States. And that community, like many communities like it across the U.S., are specifically targeted by corporations and then other towns nearby in an effort to annex and control those areas. They don't give them access to the running water systems that come to the neighborhoods next to them. They don't give them access to those public school systems. They need to get approval to join them. This is a major issue nationally. And so while I was living in one of those areas, an old white man sold a bunch of acreage across the street from my family's farm to an old white man who wanted to create a tire recycling facility that basically what it did was it ground it up and burnt tires and then buried it in the ground. The burning creating a lot of toxic chemicals in the air, which should not be released around residential areas and usually are not zoned that way. And then obviously the burying of all of this rubber in areas that are, these sand pits are connected to the water tables, like these exact sand pits are the reason that my family's farm and the farms around them and the properties around them had a 10-year drought because they dug so far in that they'd sucked all the water out. That's how you build sand pits, right? Like, you know, a little bit of education there. But so when this happened, we had to fight back. And so I'm someone who has experience working in this kind of advocacy. And so I was able to get access to putting this conversation publicly on the docket at our city council. But part of that process was canvassing the neighborhood for other members of the community that could lead that conversation publicly, not just in front of, you know, the city councils or whatever committees needed to hear them, but also for the media. Could I have gotten myself on the docket as the only speaker on this issue, gotten all of the media attention, and been a white savior? Yes, we see that happen all the time. But that's not what we're trying to do here, right? And I think that's a question we need to ask ourselves in a lot of situations. Like, what are you actually doing? When I did speak with these other people, number one, I was the last person on the docket. If time ran over because we had to do this multiple times, these are long processes. It's not just a one-stop shop. You have to get on the docket to speak, and then they have to put it up for a vote, and then everybody has to come in, and then there's like a 60-day investigation with the state to see if they're following environmental protocols, if they have the right licensure. We were able to pause them, but I moved to Connecticut. So what happens in a couple of years where they try this again? Is that community going to be capable of advocating for themselves all on their own? I hope so, and I believe in that, because the leaders in that community that we worked with are highly capable. They do not need me nor want me to speak for them. And my speech that I would always give was always about how I grew up in Connecticut. I'm a little white girl coming to live down here in Texas. And now all of a sudden we don't have running water. Like, we don't have public schools, and how I felt as a member of white privilege that my neighbors and my communities were being deliberately and racially targeted so that corporations and the neighboring communities would be able to annex their properties against their will. Because that's the truth. And because that's my role in that conversation. But back to the specific issues, because obviously, you know, their expertise is not from, oh, we know everything about recycling tires. It's about their lived experience in being in a targeted, deliberately, systemically impoverished and abused communities. But when we're dealing with these issues with institutional child abuse, again, example, like I don't have the knowledge. I can't lead that. And so if we do not include people with broad, varied experiences, then we cannot effectively lead this kind of advocacy. And furthermore,
We cannot, especially in our institutional child abuse, specifically troubled teen industry and behavior modification, any of this coercive element which comes into the cult issue, we cannot allow our anti-cult movement to become a cult. And reminder, if you don't follow us, if you haven't heard the episodes where we talk about it, but currently we all agree we kind of use the BITE model to decide what is a cult. So behavior, information, thought, and emotion control. If you can't act or think or feel a certain way because it is divergent from your community, and if you do that, you will be punished or shunned by your community members and from your community, then you're in a fucking cult. You're in a cult if your family acts that way, if your church acts that way, if your job acts that way, if your book club acts that way. This isn't about religion. This is about control. And so that goes for Survivorland too. That goes for our collective community as well. When I first got involved in the collective community outside of just like the FFS advocacy, this was something that was brought up a lot that we talk about in our episode with Jody and a couple of them with Liz, was what happened to the survivor community when CAFD fell apart. And we were warned that the issue was survivors couldn't work together, that some survivors were trying to control the community, and that other survivors were weaponizing both the community and the system, CPS, the police, all that jazz, against other survivors. And I've just got to tell you, like, we're in a situation where history absolutely repeats itself. We were all naive and or hopeful and thought, oh, we can totally work together. And to some extent, that's totally true. There are safe relationships in this movement, but that's not a rule here. Just because somebody understands what you've been through and they've been through something similar to you doesn't mean that they're going to treat you well. And for those of us who, from their families of origin, through the troubled teen industry, have attachment issues and abandonment issues and relationship issues from all of this systemic abuse, the most important thing for us to build as we work towards healing is a safe relationship with ourselves and with others. And contrary to popular belief, this whole like, you can't love others until you learn to love yourself is absolutely not true with survivors like us. If you've been consistently abused from your caretakers on, everyone who is supposed to love you and you were supposed to trust, then it's probable that you actually might need to have a relationship where somebody loves you unconditionally. That doesn't mean that they empower all your bad choices, or enable you. It just means that even if you disagree, they're not arguing with you. They're not berating you. They're not abusing you. They love you. They want to work on this. They want to communicate. Everything isn't an argument. And I know that that's how we've experienced life, but I also see that in our community when people ask questions about anything that's going on or other people, how it gets interpreted as, oh, you're using the program against them, you're attacking them. And then you see a mob shutdown of this questioning process. But in reality, also, we don't see our community holding ourselves individually or collectively accountable to treating each other properly, or at least not deflecting and projecting the program peer-on-peer attack therapy encounter groups on each other. Which is why some of the groups like ourselves who are deliberately and desperately working on building a safe relationship roundtable of advocacy have kind of kept to ourselves more or less. People didn't even know what our nonprofit name was. There were news articles when we originally filed the nonprofit in 2020 that quoted us as exposing Circle of Hope because that's who we were then. But the fun part is within a few weeks of incorporating under that name, we've had a successfully exposed and closed Circle of Hope. So we changed the name of our nonprofit. And then after that, we didn't tell anybody what we were called. We just continued to do our work as a team. We didn't brand the Right for Rights rally publicly. We didn't brand HB 557 or 560 as belonging to us. We did that both because we want everything to be inclusive and belong to the community, but also genuinely because of everything that had been happening. The other groups that were incorporating as LLCs or incorporating as nonprofits who, like us, are survivor run and broke, most of us, and didn't buy a registered agent. And then when they got into fights, they were publicly releasing their private addresses. And so like, if you didn't know, by the way, when you register for these things, if you use your home address, that is public information. People can get access to that. And we didn't know that. We didn't know that when it happened. So we were in these survivor groups and they're posting screenshots of so-and-so's home address. And then so-and-so has a GoFundMe so they can go stay at a hotel because they don't feel safe. And we're like, oh, fuck, all of our home addresses are on our nonprofit. So we changed all that information. We raised the money amongst ourselves privately to have LegalZoom become our registrar's agent. It's like $400. You guys can all do that too. And did all of that before we felt safe publicly doing this. And then for the record, iteration 2.0, there's been all these lawsuits and we're broke. We've been very public that we are poor. Troubled was recorded on Anchor for free on a cell phone that Wes Good, a survivor from the family school, sent me when my other one broke down, which was a hand-me-down from a friend in Texas. Like, we are broke. I am a single mom. I was homeless during the first 2 seasons. I am now renting a couch. I'm still recording out of my car, except, you know, we've evolved. I'm sitting here with a laptop on my lap, suffering in the heat, recording instead of on the phone because we had too many tech glitches in the first season. And I just don't want to do that anymore because they're non-fixable. And it just honestly breaks my heart. We get new listeners and they're like, you guys should like stop talking over each other. And I'm like, I know that we do that. Like, I know that ADHD wise, we did that in the first season anyways. We don't now. We record on Zoom and we're all muted while someone else is speaking to not do that to you. But in the past, we did that. But what you're mostly hearing, what's really irritating for everybody, is that the Anchor app, when we used to record the episode in one fell swoop, I guess the data would just be too much. So when it would compress all the audio lines on each other, it would compress them out of order. So there are some episodes where it's really bad, where somebody answers a question before I ask it. It's just so horrible, but that's what you get when you're doing this on a shoestring budget. Like, I got into documentary film to tell this as a docuseries, but being homeless and broke and dealing with all the CPTSD and mental health issues, I was like, I can do this for free out of my pocket on a podcast. And that's why we're a podcast. But we've been working on the docuseries for years, and we went into actual production during the Right for Rights rally in November of 2020. We shot it all on 4K. It's going to be awesome. We're super excited. But, you know, then everything hit some crazy stuff too that I'm not going to get super into, other than that another docuseries started filming that same weekend and decided to call themselves Troubled. Thankfully, they're survivor-led as well. And since we'd already had communication with them and one of the producers is from FFS, they were cool and aren't going to call it that anymore. But then the book Troubled came out and they were on social media with a Google form about Troubled Podcast, which is us, which was super fun. And we had to sort that out. And now there's a Troubled program, a narrative series that's going to be coming out, and it's going to be named Troubled. And I dig that this might sound like whining, y'all, but like, Troubled is a real thing for me. It's literally my diary. It's this personal therapy. It's a personal relationship. She's a she. This is this personal process that I started on when I was on my knees and thought I was going to die. And I was like, I just have to get this out. That's what the second and third episode really are. And it's turned into my entire life. It's led to the entire team that I work with as a nonprofit. It's led to my day job. I was recruited from Troubled for my day job. I've been hired to produce another podcast by a nonprofit that's about child abuse. I get to work in intervention and prevention of child abuse in the state I grew up in and was abused in. I mean, I owe everything in my life right now to her. And when I whine about this to my mommy, she tells me to be flattered. You know, imitation is the highest form of flattery. But, you know, it honestly doesn't feel that way, especially when it's coming from other survivors who are presenting themselves as advocates in the community, and that the whole project is advocacy based, because it's really not a trauma-informed thing to do. Can you imagine if this podcast was called Breaking Code Silence or SIA or Warriors of Hope? I would imagine, rightfully so, that those people would feel some sort of way. Not that I would ever consider doing that. And troubled is literally one word in the whole of the English language. She's Madonna, girl. She's a brand. And I get it. I was too poor to trademark in every way possible. But that's the kind of like taking advantage of an impoverished situation that I would expect from a corporate entity and not another survivor, not an advocate. And if someone is a creative professional or has a full creative team, if you can't come up with one word out of the English language, but we're supposed to expect that you're super creative and can create this entire universe, this series, this book, this movie, this, I don't know, virtual reality video game, whatever. Like, how am I supposed to believe in your creative potential if you can't come up with a word that isn't already branded by a survivor in the same space? And so, yes, I'm whining in my diary, but I hope that if anything, it will serve as a please don't do this to other people. Like, seriously. And if you just don't care empathetic-wise, then let me remind you that Pacer is an account that you can register for yourself. And then you can look up all the Breaking Code Silence lawsuits and see how survivors feel about people taking their name or branding. It can get really ugly. And I dig that nobody's worried about that with me because everybody knows I'm broke. So you win, I guess. But I'm the only one that's broke out there. The rest of them, they were smart enough to get insurance and lawyers and all that stuff. Well, the smart side, but then also like there's a level of privilege that I just am not in that world. Which is why when we do have a platform, this is what I can offer and what I can use to help elevate other survivors. We really need to share it. And if you do have access that somebody doesn't have, you definitely need to hold that door open. And just like the advocates that came before us in this same space, who broke glass ceilings, paved roads, reached behind them, and pushed others forward and led from the back, I hope that we can all become that. Our inner circle's been so focused on proving our critics wrong, our parents, the program, and those in the community that don't vibe or jazz with us, that we've compromised on our boundaries for the past couple years, and it's taken an extreme toll on our mental health. But like I said, this weekend is the 18-year anniversary of when I turned 18 and I walked out of the program. So for me and for my team, I think that this has to be the year of boundaries. And if you're into astrology, not that I am, but I'll link the one person I listened to about this solar eclipse and Venus being in the North Node or whatever, the last time this happened was actually when I turned 18. So like, we also need to get better with boundaries being set with us. You know, if we're going to be trauma informed in a community where we haven't been allowed to have personal boundaries, body autonomy, even in our thoughts, our minds, our emotions, then as we heal and as we become the cure to that cult culture, that has to be paramount and a priority. Like, I don't know about y'all, but I've personally been booted and banned from survivor groups because I personally chose to block one of the many mods or admins because I just wanted to. And then I had other admins in my DMs that I didn't know being like, what's your problem with them? And it's like, dude, I don't have an issue. Like, I shouldn't need to have an issue. In this community, we should just like recognize that people can just set boundaries with whomever they want. In fact, I'm sure there's a lot of you listening still, especially if you're still listening, that I've personally blocked on my personal channel, especially over the last year as we've been addressing the lack of boundaries. One of those projects that at one point used our name that I mentioned previously hit us up a few months ago and was like, hey, why did you block us on Troubled's page? And so we had a conversation and we chose to not block accounts on Troubled. But that decision to keep Troubled accessible and transparent meant that, for me at least, this is how I balanced it, that I could go on like a complete barrage of blocking everybody I felt like on my personal account, just my personal account. And so don't take it personally. I just need boundaries between myself and the broader community. And as you guys get involved in the collective community, you really need to do that for yourself too. We don't want to lose any more survivors. We don't want to lose any more excellent advocates in this space, whether or not we're all individually BFFs or are just having fun with the parasocial relationships. I'm going to keep plugging this because like it is blowing my mind right now and y'all need to look into this concept. I promise, not that you asked, but I'm going to get a lot more into it in my 18-year anniversary episode. That'll probably also be coming out this weekend because I haven't been posting anything, even though I've been recording a lot, because I just felt like Troubled wasn't safe, you know, with everything that I just explained. I felt like the space wasn't safe for me and didn't belong to me, and I just didn't belong in the community at all. Because for the record, I've quite literally been told I don't belong in the community at all. But you know what? I wasn't exactly welcome in the home I was born into. I never felt comfortable in any environment I've been placed in ever. So what the fuck else is new, right? But as a perfect example, I spoke about a situation in my story episodes with the girl that was on complete exile that I went into the freezer with and asked if she wanted me to help her run away and escape and all that jazz. And I included her in my story because that moment is profound for me. And because of that, because that's a deeply etched moment that I've replayed many times, I have a personal relationship with it, it's part of my PTSD, I projected that with that moment and my personal experience onto her as like I had a relationship with her, as in we were friends. And then like the examples I brought up earlier when I questioned something in a group about the family school with another survivor, 3 or 4 other people jumped me being like, oh, you're calling them up at the table, like blah, 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 you know, accusing me of what I absolutely was not doing. At least I don't think so. I should probably reread that. And she was one of them. And I hit her up privately and I was like, this really hurts my feelings because I thought we were friends and it sounds like you think I'm an asshole. And she was like, we are not friends. No offense, but we are not friends. We literally never spoken in real life. I was literally on blackout with you the whole time you were there. And that's not what friendship is. And deadass, y'all, like, that fucking floored me. She was an important person in my life, but she wasn't my friend. And as someone with RSD, I don't say any of this to in any way reject anyone who feels like we have a relationship based on the internet, because for the record, based on my neurodivergence and trauma, I think we all have relationships too. So you are not rejected in this way. I just feel like we all need to get real with ourselves so that we can protect ourselves and so that we can build real relationships with people who actually care about us too. And again, I say this as someone who has no relationships in my world outside of survivors and, you know, my sister and my parents. And then one friend, my girlfriend, Jess. And it's been great moving back and getting to spend time with Jess because she knew me before I got sent away. We stayed friends after I got back. We remained friends through our adulthood. So this is someone who's known me at all these stages and just gets me. And it's an incredibly effortless relationship in which I feel completely seen and understood. And I feel like, I believe this to be true, that she loves me for what's weird about me. She loves me for my quirks. She loves me for the way that I stim and I'm a total fucking weirdo. And it's so much better to have one person that actually digs you than to have a bunch of acquaintances that just make you feel like you have friends. Because when you realize they're not your friends or they turn on you, like in the community, as an example, weaponizing of the system, we've had survivors where, because of Facebook posts in survivor groups, other survivors called the police on them. They lost their kids. They got institutional, all these crazy things. Well, guess what? That's happened with me. That's happened with me with not survivors, but girls that I had fake, you know, back in my 20s. Like, let's get tagged on all these Facebook photos with each other and make everybody jealous friends. When I didn't want to be friends with those girls anymore because of my neurodivergence and because I'm just a very direct, honest person, I told them I couldn't rock with them. Our lives were too different, yada, yada. Well, they stalked me. They threw bricks through my window. They sent CPS to my house. They sent animal control to my house. They just wrecked my absolute shit. And this stuff happens, which is why I've been so silent, because up until I moved back to Connecticut, when I was living in that trailer without access to running water, without access to electricity, going weeks where I'm quite literally eating scoops of peanut butter, and then for dinner I would have like a can of soup that I would heat directly in the can on my freaking little, what do you call them? Like the little, I don't know the name for it, the little coily heater thing. English. Well, that's poverty, y'all, which, for the record, our community being chronically impoverished and housing insecure and homeless is a regular symptom of this trauma. I haven't been housing secure since I went into the TTI. I was homeless within 6 months, on the street level homeless after leaving the TTI. I've been on the street and in shelters since. I've lived in my car. I haven't had a bed in years, and I haven't had my own room since I was a teenager. But I also got pregnant while I was homeless as a teenager, the summer after I left the troubled teen industry. So being a single mother and dealing with this kind of poverty, like, it's such a huge risk that the system could take my kid. And the only reason the system hasn't taken my kid, honestly, in my opinion, is because I'm white. And I also want to be clear that a lot of the survivors that have had the system weaponized against them, either from other survivors, which is way too prevalent, or because they sought mental help and they tested positive for drugs in a state that doesn't allow fucking cannabis, and so they lost their kids, whatever. I mean, it's not a risk that anybody's willing to take. And many of them were unmelanated. But if you haven't heard our episode with children's rights, Erin McGinnis, please check that out. That was my favorite interview that I've done. I would say it was our most important contribution, but I think that getting involved in Circle of Hope, obviously, and the work that we did with Justice Cornelius is more personally important to me. But in a broad scope, Erin McGinnis and children's rights blew my mind about foster care. We've got 53% of Black families in the United States are going to be investigated and intervened, infiltrated by CPS. Foster care is extremely racist, but it's also classist. And with everybody suing everybody and being super broke, you can see why a lot of us are keeping our opinions to ourselves right now. But we've also shrunk ourselves, and we've put ourselves into a code of silence. And while I've spent the last 7+ years in Texas trying to learn to be a less argumentative, aggressive, contrarian, there's a huge difference between being peaceful and being harmless. It's important to recognize that we were weaponized by psychopaths using brainwashing and behavior modification. We were weaponized against our peers, the world, and ourselves. And maybe you haven't pulled out the pin and gone off yet, but you still have to diffuse the situation, or the risk is always there. But at least for me, I will always be a bomb. I will always be a weapon of potentially mass destruction. But my job is to avoid self-combustion and any collateral damage. And as I heal myself, hopefully someday soon, I'll get to set my eyes on the right target and let it all out. Because baby, they made this, so this is meant for them, you know? And who knows that world better than us? We are the most dangerous thing for these psychopaths that tried to make us. And if that's not super enticing, let's just deconstruct this for a minute. Most of us, I'm going to you at me right now, so if this doesn't apply to you, you were taught from birth that you were not allowed to be angry. You couldn't object, you couldn't talk back, you couldn't fight back. Your anger was in no way justified. You were simply being defiant and ungrateful and difficult and all that jazz. And at least in my program, because we were AA-based, there was a huge emphasis on anger being a secondary emotion. They would give you this whole horribly adrenalized and or euphoric experience after berating you as a group for 30+ minutes, sometimes hours. And then many of you know that they would ask you how you were feeling or what you were thinking. And even if there's like this little 12-year-old redheaded stepchild ADHD kid who's clenching his fists and crying, if he says, I'm mad or I'm pissed or I'm angry, they, are all going to chant the whole, no, you're not. Anger is a secondary emotion. What are you really? From the gist of there are only two emotions, love and fear. Which, for the record, I genuinely believed that was a part of the program that I kept into just a couple years ago. And thanks to Black women, again, we should thank them for everything, but this is something we can give them, the embodiment in the US of righteous rage, the validity of that, the justification for that, and the power it has to create real systemic change. Bearing witness to the righteous rage of Black women has inspired the fuck out of this chick to stop denying and repressing my rage. That is something that should be accessible to all of us. We have to get there. So if you're angry, I fucking dig it. If you're angry that everybody seems to know what we're talking about at this point, but they're looking at all the pieces of the cake separately, so they don't think it's a big deal, and they're definitely not going to eat it before it goes bad, I dig it. If you're mad because the world has consistently rejected you, shunned you, and blamed you for the abuse you've endured, I dig that too. If you're mad that legislators and politicians know exactly what they're doing because they're funding it, I'm right the fuck there with you. So now this begs the question, what are we going to do with it? So I've laid out a lot of my recommendations. I think we need to self-educate ourselves so that we can deconstruct our programming and our deliberate miseducation and actually get to work dealing with this. I also think we need to create a safer, more inclusive, diverse community where everyone feels like they have a voice and their experience and existence in that space is valid. We need to use our trauma information to create that space and to create a better movement and not use it against each other and definitely not use it against ourselves. And I think we can do this by education and by focusing on our own personal healing. You'll need to create some space for yourselves and then a circle around you of people who really dig you. And then extend this to them because I know you really want to talk about it in a safe space, but they need to also understand what's going on. So if your friends are into comics, have them check out Joe versus Alon online. It's a free graphic novel by a survivor, Joe Nobody from Alon, and it's probably my favorite resource. My personal favorite documentary about the troubled teen industry as of now, and it has been for years, is Fix My Kid. It's only available on their website, so go check out fixmykidmovie.com. The best investigative book on the troubled teen industry is, of course, still Maya Salovitz's Help at Any Cost, and it's something that people will regularly recommend that you refer to people that you care about in your life, like your parents or your spouses or your close friends, as it really gives a concise education on just the whole scope. Dr. Yanya Lalich from the Fix My Kid movie, also in her own right, she's amazing, has a program now called Take Back Your Life Recovery. Their new session starts in May, so if you're listening to this in real time, go look at signing up. They do have scholarships if you're dealing with the poverty that we all deal with, so just don't not do it because it costs something. And it's designed by survivors of high control groups, #cults, like Dr. Yanya Lalich, who, for the record, if you haven't heard her story, she's on all the podcasts and in the movies, she took down her cult. So I think she knows a little bit about them. And she also offers it to mental health professionals. So if you're one of our base, we have a lot of social workers, psychologists, and people in the mental health field that listen to the program because they're fascinated by the anthropological audio telling of like the survivor experience. I think we're more interested in the relatability for our program survivors, especially when we're new. I don't listen to survivor testimonies personally myself much anymore, but I do listen to the expert interviews. Like I've listened to every podcast interview with Dr. Lalich, right? Every episode with Maya Salovitz, every episode with Dr. Ariel Short. But for those that are from the mental health community and could potentially be treating survivors, we could not recommend that you take this course more so that you can better understand what you're dealing with and be more effective in your approach. And I just want to remind the survivors that want to focus on getting access to justice that you are all human trafficking survivors. Human trafficking falls under federal jurisdiction. there is no statute of limitations. And for many of you that survived restraint, there are a lot of states where long-term restraint, so over 30 minutes or multiple people or prone or any of those natures, they actually fall under sexual assault guidelines, thus don't have statutes of limitations or have expanded ones. But even if you're not within your statutes of limitations, like Amanda Householder, she's a co-host on this podcast and a co-founder of our nonprofit, she's outside of her statutes, but she's still suing Agape, Agape's Church, Berean Baptist Church, Circle of Hope. You can find attorneys that'll work with you, especially if you organize a group of survivors from that program. Our nonprofit is going to be having a virtual event in the next month to celebrate our 1-year anniversary as a nonprofit. Surprise! We're coming out with our relationship because we've been married for a year, so we believe in it. We'll be announcing a lot of action items that we're working on that we want to make sure that the public is both aware of and has access to, survivors and supporters. And one of those things is we get hit up constantly by survivors that are not already connected with the group advocacy from their own program, asking us how to navigate this process, how to request your records, how to put in a report, how to file, any kind of lawsuit, contact the attorneys, what they need to request and how they need to navigate that. And so we're really glad that we've been able to have those conversations. But if you're listening, you're like, hey, bitch, we were supposed to have a Zoom. Yeah, I'm sorry, and I need to get back to everyone. But there have been many balls I've dropped, and let's be real about this. I'm one person. I don't get paid for this, and we do the best we can. Not that it's an excuse. It's just we've had to come to terms with the limitations of our bandwidth, which is why we're going to be coming more publicly with the nonprofit, because we've gotten to the point where we do need to recruit more survivors and more volunteers and be more collaborative. We're super good at working on coalitions and supporting other groups and getting along in that space and whatever. We're just really bad about inviting our new friends over for the sleepover because we are so burnt out on thinking we could trust people that we couldn't. And I've been super big on how I think flattery is always a manipulation. And that's what's happened. Most of the people that contacted us, oh my God, we really want to get involved with what you guys are doing. So awesome, yada, yada, giving us all these random compliments out the wazoo, are all the same people that number one, used and exploited us, but number two, became a barrier or a deliberate obstacle in our way. And yeah, there's the keychain slogan that the realer you get, the smaller your circle of friends. That's true. But we're also radical abolitionists, and there's a lot of people that are still very confused and think that the conversation on reform has some place in the troubled teen industry, and it doesn't. And there's some people that think the troubled teen industry started in the 60s, and it didn't. But we all make a lot of mistakes as we try to figure out information that is really not accessible to the public because they are deliberately being corrupt and shadow lordy. So I dig it. There's a ton of things in the first season that I desperately need to edit out, and I'm sorry and thank you. Because we miss you guys, we just finally have realized that we were trying to be harmless and not peaceful. And we were focusing on trying to fit the model that the collective community had really publicly demanded when this movement really got all synced up a few years ago, which was an unrealistic expectation of, and quote unquote, for those of you who got accused of not being a good leader in the movement because of this. But, some members of the movement wanted all leaders to be unimpeachable, which is just not a thing. We're a community of people who fucked up hard, and fucked up a lot and continue to fuck up. We've got tattoos, we smoke, we cuss, we drink, we do drugs. Some of us are witches and Satanists, and we've got every flavor of queer the heart could imagine or want because we want all flavors. And unimpeachable is just completely an unrealistic expectation if we're in a politically correct box. So for me, for Little Miss stick her foot in her mouth and royally fuck up and then spend the rest of my life trying to make up for that time, I told my friends why can't I use the N-word if I use it ironically? I'm not racist. My boyfriend's black. I guess it was good for me to learn to reel it in and tone it down and think before I speak and work on myself before I opened my mouth again. But now that I really do have a clean record of not being an asshole, at least in this community, I realized that avoiding conflict so that I could be impeachable and nobody would have screenshots to prove that I'm the asshole they say I am isn't who I want to be. Because for the record, it doesn't matter if you don't do anything to anybody. People are going to say you did, and that's just the reality, especially if you're choosing to engage with people with complex post-traumatic stress disorder and specific traumas around relational things, paranoia or trust issues, attachment issues, all of these things. I used to ask my therapist, like, is it me? Is it a vibe I give off? Like, how am I attracting this? And they were very clear about it. They told me that I was surrounding myself with traumatized people. While I couldn't pick my family, who has all the intergenerational trauma one could want, they're there. And I did pick getting involved in animal rescue, but that's a whole traumatized community. And then I joined this one. And so she was like, you have to pick. You have to bail out of one of these traumatized communities or you're going to fucking die. And that's why I left animal rescue. And I kind of bailed out of this community because I thought I wasn't allowed to be present here and also be myself. And so I was trying to evolve into a different version of myself. But thanks to therapy and a lot of support with safe relationships and self-awareness, I realized how all of this is a cycle and a pattern and a reenactment for me. I have convinced myself that everybody is going to reject me in every situation I'm in, that I pull up at the party and I won't get out of the fucking car. And like, I mean that literally. My childhood was very much me staying in the back of the car when my parents would go to their Amway sponsor's house or go out to dinner with their friends. Like, I would sit there for 2 hours in the car refusing to come in. And this wasn't me being defiant. This wasn't me proving that you couldn't make me go to the restaurant. This was because I felt completely paralyzed by how uncomfortable I was around other people. And then after years and years of bullshit in middle school, I was like, fuck everybody. I don't give a fuck what you think. And that right there, my teenage me, the one that they put in this program, she's my favorite fucking version of myself. And she's still in here, and I'm telling her to shut the fuck up all the time. So healing this inner child shit isn't about something in the past. It's about a relationship that I continue to have with myself today. Except now I'm the one inflicting this trauma and this censorship and this repression on myself. I'm the one tone policing and checking this little Miranda energy, telling her she's not allowed to stand up for herself or question anything, because that's going to cause a problem. But you know what I've learned through my safe relationships with the survivors that I've built what I've built with, and with the safe relationships in my outside life? People who love you do not fucking treat you like that. People who love you don't need you to be a positive fucking light worker and super harmless and calm and all that jazz all the time. That's not realistic. And if that's what they expect from you, then they don't like you. And that's not what I like about myself. Those aren't things I value or honor about myself. And they never have been. They're purely the program. And since I'm trying to deprogram, I don't want to treat myself that way. And I'm not going to allow anyone else to treat me that way anymore. And for those of you like myself who have a hard time setting boundaries, I just want to remind you that as you learn to claim your autonomy and stand up for yourself and defend yourself, it's a pendulum. You're gonna possibly seem like you're overreacting because you're not used to being able to set those boundaries in the first place. And we are completely embarrassing, self-humiliating creatures. But don't give up. It's going to suck for a minute, but it's totally worth it. It's like, imagine this is that girl who's a jogger who was assaulted on one of her jogging trips. And then if you approach her from behind or touch her shoulder, she turns around and wallops you in the face, as she should, because you don't touch people. And then once we've managed to create a safe space with ourselves and stop silencing the inner child, stop telling ourselves we don't have a right to be angry about any of these things, most of which I think you probably have a right to be angry about, maybe we can expand all of that to the broader community. It really bums me out when I see a survivor-led group or project or campaign that's excluding access deliberately to other survivors. Not only do you need to be the adult you needed for yourself, but if you're going to step into collective or public advocacy, then you need to be that representative publicly and collectively. You don't have to like everybody, you don't have to be friends with everybody, and you definitely don't have to agree with everybody. If we are an anti-cult movement, then we have to operate opposite of how cults operate, which means prioritizing and appreciating diversity and people who question things and bring things to the table that weren't there already. Debates do not need to be arguments, but also discussions don't need to be debates. Either way, the more accessible, transparent, and inclusive, the better. If you want to rock by yourself and be an individual, I'm all about that. I'm a lifelong freaking weirdo individual. But I wouldn't have been able to do as much healing on this specific wound if I didn't have the support team that I have. And so I hope that even if it's just one person who's also been through this experience, that you find that person. Oh, don't worry, baby. I believe in you. That's why I'm making this episode. I hope we can move forward and carry the survivors from the past in respect and memorial. And I know that we can do a better job of treating ourselves and Survivorland better. Y'all remember when you used to make those like little tapes, mixtapes for your friends and trade them on the school bus? Yeah, let me know if you want the link to like my Survivor playlist that I've been compiling over the past few years. All my like inspiration for my shadow work cry fests or my like, oh, fight the system, fuck you all music, which if you want that part, it's really just mostly The Coop and Saul Williams. Ooh, and Hallucination and Super Champ and Black Bear. But definitely don't forget to connect with us on all the socials if you haven't, at Talk Troubled, and leave us a review or rate us if you like us. If you don't, shut the fuck up. You can't have your own fucking opinion unless it's my opinion, and I'll fucking block you. Okay, bye.